Welcome to the Fortified Life podcast, where we learn how to develop a dependency on Jesus in the marketplace. From the boardroom to the bathroom, God is with you. Here's our host, author, speaker, teacher, encourager, stewardship coach, and my husband, the man they call Mr. Fortified, Jason Davis.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Jason Davis, aka Mr. Fortified. We're back with another episode of the Fortified Life podcast, where we are passionate about developing a dependency on Jesus in the marketplace. And we get a chance to do that every single week by interviewing authors, speakers, CEOs, people who are just making a great impact in the marketplace for the Lord. And it's no different this time. But before I bring on our guest, and I'm really excited. This is somebody that I really started following during the pandemic, actually. And she is just a wealth of knowledge and has a great story. But before I bring her on, let me introduce her to you. Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith is a board-certified internal medicine physician and work-life-integration researcher. She is the founder of Restorasis, a professional development agency dedicated to restoring well-being in the workplace through its proprietary framework to help companies support their employees with work-life integration and burnout prevention strategies. As a busy physician, author, and mom, she understands that life's demands can leave you feeling mentally overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and physically tired. Daily, she helps with high achievers deal with their work-rest imbalance and find actionable answers to thriving in their lifestyle they desire. Folks, welcome to the Fortified Life, Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Absolutely. Dr. Dalton-Smith, what's very interesting is, and I remember you talking about this a few years ago, so you are a practicing physician, and yet you get asked for speaking engagements and to work with companies. So how does that work? How does a doctor do that?
Well, I've been in clinical practice for about 20 years, so I have a lot more control over my schedule than I would if I was an intern or just starting out.
Got it.
I'm part of a 10 physician group practice. And so now I'm more of in a leadership role, so I don't have as many clinical call duties and things that I've had in the past, which has really freed me up to pursue some other interests and things that I love to do.
Excellent. I love that with the flexibility. Dr. Dalton-Smith, one of the things that you really specialize in is talking about this notion of rest. Now, while people have talked about it before, you've actually come up with something proprietary, and you even talk about it in your book, Sacred Rest. So coming out of the pandemic, Doctor, how important is finding that balance of rest, just kind of, as people have been saying, in this new normal?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Most of us don't really know what rest is, and then trying to find balance seems like too much pressure. I think because too often that balance doesn't exist for most of us. We're really needing to kind of determine, how do we integrate all of these different energy levels that we have and energy drains that we have in our lives in such a way that we have an ebb and flow between the energy use and the energy restoration. And that, for me, is really what rest is about. It's that energy restoration. That's the balance I think we're really seeking. Pour out and pour back in without having to take a vacation, without having to quit our jobs. How do you be restored in a way that allows you to continue to do the things you love and not just have to break away from your life to get restored?
Doctor, you said something there, the taking vacation or having to, like extremes. In your opinion, why do you think people kind of jump to the extremes when it comes to rest, or if they're beginning to feel burnout?
I think that's what we've been trained. We've been trained to think that that these are the ways that we prevent burnout. We prevent burnout by taking a sabbatical, or, to making sure you're using all your PTO and all your days off. And all of those things are great. But if you only get restored 3 times a year at your 1 week vacation, you're going to be burned out most of your life. And that's the problem. Most of us have been trying to do that because stress prevention and stress management, as the way we've approached it in the past, simply does not work for long-term sustainable joy, energy, peace, and the ability to really function at your best consistently.
Wow. Dr. Dalton-Smith, I think this is kind of the perfect segue to dive into the book, Sacred Rest, Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, Restore Your Sanity. That, I love the subtitles there. What played a factor in the naming of the book for you?
Well, the sacred part of it was because for me, myself, I honestly had no respect for rest whatsoever. My mindset was one of such, I felt like rest was one of those things people did who just could not keep up with the rest of us. I mean, I was trained as a physician that you just keep going. The need to just break and all of that just wasn't a part of how we were trained. We were trained to produce and to continue going, exhausted or not. That's just the reality of it. 12, 13, 14, 16-hour days, that's the normal. And so for me, when I thought about rest was like, okay, I don't really need to do that unless I'm sick or something. And so I had to gain a new respect for it. And that's what the sacredness part of it was. I had to see it as something with value. I had to see it as having as much value as the work that I was doing, not as a second-class citizen that, if I have time, I'll fit this in, but that it was something I needed to make sure that I created space in my life for, and that I honored it the way God honored it.
I think that's key. Doctor, honoring it because God honors it. Do you think we underestimate rest because we don't always look at it the way maybe Scripture highlights rest? Do you think that could be a case, Doctor?
Yeah, I think many of us, when we look at the creation story, we, in my opinion, got it wrong. We looked at it and we see where, it says God did all of these things and it was good. And then on the 7th day, God rested, as if to say that once the work is done and we can look at it and say, oh, it's good, now I've earned a right to rest. That wasn't really what was happening. God doesn't need rest. God doesn't get tired like that. He's the source and unlimited source of all sources. So he doesn't get tired like that. And so when we start looking at the pieces of the creation story, on the 6th day, man was created. And then it says on the 7th day, God rested. Well, what started to really kind of stand out to me in that story is that what was man doing on the 7th day? On the 6th day, man wasn't even the first thing created. So our first full day on the earth is the 7th day. And when you start looking at it that way, we weren't actually sent out to do the work God told us about when we were created, to subdue and have dominion and all of that. We weren't told to do that on the 7th day, which is our first full day. Our first day before we ever got to work was a day of rest. And I think that's the mindset shift many of us have to go over to, is that I don't work to earn my rest. I should be working from a place of rest. That rest is where we are poured into, equipped, and prepared for the work we're being sent out to do. So we're not being sent out from a place of depletion and pouring out of our emptiness. We're being sent out to pour out from our overflow.
No, that's good, Doctor, right there. You might be preaching overflow. I like that. So as we dive into the book, you have 7 types of rest. You talk about physical rest, mental rest, emotional rest, spiritual rest, social, and sensory and creative. And Doctor, upon first glance, somebody, for those listening, they might be like, wow, Doctor, really? I never even thought about rest that way. So if you don't mind just taking us a quick walkthrough of, hey, rest may not be what you think it is. It actually involves these 7 categories.
Yeah, that's the trick, I think, for a lot of us. We think of rest just as laying around on the weekend watching Netflix or whatever it is you like to do. And we think of it really as just cessation activities, just stopping. And rest is restorative. And so some of those restorative processes have activities attached to them, but the activities fill us back up rather than depleting it. And so with those 7 different types, as you mentioned, the physical is broken down into 2 components. You have the passive, which we all know about, sleeping and napping. Those are things that we kind of do naturally, some of us. And then we have the active physical components of rest, which we often don't think about, which are the things that help with how our muscles feel and our back and our legs and our circulation and our lymphatic system. So it includes things like a leisure walk, when you're just you're not trying to count off your Fitbit steps. You're just allowing your circulation to kind of get moved around, or you're stretching on the floor, or you're doing some neck rolls at your desk to undo some of the damage of staring at your computer, all day. So the things that we do to make our body feel better is a part of the physical rest. The things that improve your circulation, your flexibility, and how your body actually functions. That includes everything from even the ergonomics of where you do your work. Is your workstation toxic to your body? Because that's good as well.
Wow.
Then you mentioned mental rest. Mental rest deals with the ability to clear out our mind and to concentrate and focus. And a lot of us struggle with this. If you have a mental rest deficit, one sign of that could be if you find that when it's time to go to bed at night, you lay down, you close your eyes, and you're thinking all the thoughts. You're running through your to-do list. You're thinking about conversations you had earlier in the day, and you have just a hard time clearing out your mind. And forms of mental rest include anything that allows you to concentrate and focus. So that could be any type of meditative type practice that you use. And, meditation has gotten some bad reputation because of how some people kind of use it. But just to give you an example of what meditation can look like that some people may not think of, if you're someone who likes to go for a jog or lift heavy weights, and occasionally I have somebody who's up north and they're like, oh, I chop wood or do something like that. When you're doing these repetitive activities that require your mind to focus to do the activity, you're focusing on one specific thing. For example, if you're jogging, you're focusing on your foot pace and your breathing, because if you don't, you're going to have a hard time jogging. Well, that focusing on 1 or 2 things is a mindfulness meditative type process. It's forcing your brain to not think of all the thoughts. It's thinking on a specific thing that doesn't require you a lot of effort. You just have to stay focused on it to be able to complete the task. Same with repetitive activities like chopping wood or lifting weights and doing reps. And that, for a lot of people, can help clear their mental space because they're not thinking all these other things, and they get a moment of mental rest in those times. Another example of mental rest for someone who maybe doesn't like meditation in the sense, the normal sense of the word as some people use it. What I do is, if I'm worried about something, I have a child who, he just finished his first year of college, so I had a lot of things I could worry about last year related to him. When my mind starts trying to worry and get into a negative mental tangle, it starts kind of going down that negative track. What I do is I focus on one characteristic of God. So those things that are true, that are noble, that are worthy. I focus on one characteristic of God, and every time my brain tries to worry and go down that negative track, I say whatever that characteristic is. And so for me, the one I typically use is faithful. I believe God's faithful, whether my kid's in front of me or not. And so I say that in my mind to bring my thoughts back under obedience. And I think that's another way that you can practice mindfulness or meditation, without, having it feel like it has gotten off course from what the scripture says about meditation.
Mm-hmm.
The other type of rest that you mentioned was spiritual. And spiritual rest really boils down to don't get me wrong, we should all be reading our Bibles. We should also have time where we are doing devotional type things and spending time with God in that way. But I think a big part of it is making sure that you're also spending time building relationship with God. And so I call those the times where your mouth's closed and your heart's open. You're not always asking for something. You're not always in prayer or inquiring for answers. You're actually just enjoying his presence. And I feel like that's something we've gotten away from, the pleasure of his presence and understanding the restorative properties that happen with that just by spending time with him.
That's good right there with the spiritual rest. What about, I know you kind of started to go down this path with the mental side, but emotional rest. And a lot of times, Doctor, when we hear more internal things, and we know that there was a lot that was highlighted and reported during the pandemic with mental health, what can we do emotionally?
Yeah, emotional rest looks at the ability that you have or the freedom that you feel to authentically express the emotions that you are having. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of us we have a bit of emotional labor that we carry. We don't feel like we have the ability to just be real, raw, and authentic about what's going on with us. We actually try to make it more palatable for people, so it's easier for them to digest, so to speak. And so I think it's important to identify those people in your life who you feel comfortable sharing authentically about your emotions, whether that's a trusted friend, a pastor, a spouse, a counselor, whoever that may be. But we also have to then take a look at when are the times in our life that we carry an extra amount of emotional labor. Because, for example, I'll give an example of what emotional labor may look like. If you're somebody working in any type of customer service, and somebody comes up and you're having to, work with them, and they're just being a jerk. Nothing that you did, they're just in a mood, and you're having to deal with that and keep a smile on your face and all of those things. You are suppressing what you're really feeling to be able to perform at the level that you're expected to perform at in customer service. Now, you're not being inauthentic necessarily, because you'd lose your job and probably be fired if you told them what you really thought. It's part of being professional. And so that professionalism for some of us is a level of emotional labor. And you need to recognize that, because never having opportunities to say how you really feel can make it feel as if your emotions aren't valid and that they don't have a voice. And so I think we need to recognize that, because I feel like a lot of us, we've trained ourselves because of professionalism to not share our emotions. And it's got us in really a dangerous situation at this point, with a lot of mental health related crisis from people not being able to open up.
Well, Doctor, in kind of a play on words, you're saying professionalism can impact us in a way that we're not anticipating, perhaps, by trying to save face. Yeah. Absolutely.
Physician and nurse suicide rates are through the roof. And I oftentimes tell people, the type of rest I realize now that I needed most was emotional rest. I work in internal medicine, so I work with people in the ICU and the ER. Death was a daily occasion. It's life in internal medicine. You deal with a lot of death. And unfortunately, because of where I live in a smaller town, oftentimes the people on that bed at the end of life or coming to that ER were people I actually knew. They were my patients, or they were people I went to church with, or, they weren't just someone with a chart and a name. They were people I knew, their grandkids. I'd seen the dogs' pictures, all of those things. And so in the middle of a life and death situation, as someone who's very kind of empathic, I'm very soft-hearted, and so I'm very empathic. Everything in me may want to burst out into tears. But I've been trained to shut that down when I'm in the ICU, because it doesn't serve my patient, the family, or the nurses who are all looking to me to be the person who's leading them. And so I've trained myself to not go there with my emotions. However, those emotions and that pain and that grief still has to be dealt with. It deals with me. And that's what was a big part of my burnout, was an emotional level. Okay. Some people call it compassion fatigue, but an emotional level of burnout that was coming because of never dealing with that, just trying to shut it down.
Wow. The emotions still have to be dealt with after that. Wow. That's so.
Or they deal with you.
Yeah. Indeed. Doctor, these last two, at least I felt in reading the book, I think these last two types of rest really catch people by surprise, and that's the creative rest and the sensory rest. So give us a little bit of insight on those two, because I think most people, as they're reading through those, they're tracking with you, okay, emotional, mental, physical, and then they get down to sensory and creative, and they kind of go, never really thought about that.
And there's another one that you missed with social.
Yes, social.
I'll discuss those three. So social rest, it kind of goes along with emotional to some degree, in that it requires us to evaluate the people in our lives and determine if people are negatively pulling from our social energy or if they are positively pouring back in. Most of the people we deal with are negatively pulling from us socially. They're our clients, our coworkers, our bosses, our kids, our spouses. They all need things from you. And so then it's important to determine who are the people in your life who don't need anything from you, that you can just have fun with, that you enjoy being around and they enjoy being around you, and it's not pulling from you in that way. And on top of that, we also have to determine, especially if you're an introvert versus an extrovert, what is the level of people interaction you actually need? Every single one of us needs other people that we're in community with to some degree. And so whether that is, whether that's a few people or a bunch of people like the extroverts we all need to have time that we're with people who are life-giving. And then we need to make sure that we, have some time by ourselves as well. And then, as you mentioned, sensory and creative are two that are often, people are like, I never thought about that. Sensory deals with looking at your sensory inputs. So everything from the lights, the sounds, the smells, all the tactile experiences that are in your atmosphere and the effect that they have on you. Most of us are not overly aware of our surroundings. We think because we've kind of learned how to zone them out or, not pay attention to it, that it's not really having an effect on us. However, in order to zone out, kind of like, for example, if let's say there's an elevator that's dinging beside your office or something, or, some other sound that you hear where you work at over and over again, and you get to where you don't hear it anymore. Well, for you not to hear it, your brain has to filter it so that it becomes just part of your background noise. Now, unfortunately, your brain is being fatigued the entire time that it's doing that. And so it's the same with any other type of sensory input. That sensory input is affecting our nervous system, whether we are consciously aware of it or not.
Wow.
And then what most of us do when we get to a place of sensory overload, where we have had all of the sensory input we can deal with, we become hypersensitized to sensation. And so we start seeing things like, for example, road rage doesn't usually go with the morning traffic. It comes with the evening traffic, the afternoon when people are going home. Well, the side effect of consistent sensory overload syndrome is irritation, agitation, rage, or anger.
My goodness.
And so if you find that you're like, I'm good, and then somewhere between 4 and 6, I'm like, not so good. I'm nipping at people, and I'm short-tempered, and I don't, I'm not nice. I don't have any peace anymore in that area. Sensory overload may be the issue. Another thing with that is if you find that you have a very difficult time enjoying sensory-rich experiences, and that goes everything from, listening to like fireworks, coming up with the holidays and things, from fireworks to, like concerts, or, even having an intimate relationship with your spouse. if those type of sensory rich experiences, you're like, I'm not really interested. I don't really like those things. It could be because you have a sensory rest deficit. You will reject sensory rich experiences if your body has come to feel like sensations are always overloading it.
Wow. That's very insightful there, Doctor. My goodness. The overload of sensory, especially something like fireworks with the noise. And I know I've definitely haven't thought about the impact that way, especially with how you're describing rest. So I feel like the listeners, if you're not taking notes, you should be. The doctor, she is, the class is in session right now. Doctor, oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I think there was one more.
Oh, I'm sorry. The final one is just creative.
Yeah.
And creative rest is basically thinking about the beauty in the world and how it inspires you. Most of us are at some level dealing with a creative rest deficit, particularly coming out of 2020, because there were so many changes around that time. We were all learning how to do different things in new ways. And so we used a lot of creative energy and problem solving. And so when you think about creative energy, just don't think about like, oh, well, I'm not an artist or a musician, so I don't need creative rest. The untrue. If you're being innovative, if you're thinking outside of the box, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're in marketing, if you're a teacher, if you're a doctor, if you're anybody who has to solve problems and take different parts, bring it together and come up with a solution, you're using creative energy. And if you're using creative energy, it can become depleted. And so creative rest is the rest you experience when you allow yourself to appreciate beauty in whatever form that may be. Whether that is like the mountains, the trees, like natural beauty, or man-made beauty like music and art and theater.
That's powerful, Doctor, because I've noticed when I just take walks and get fresh air, something about that scenery, whether you're sitting out on the lake or you see the trees, I know I've experienced that before, so that's very interesting. The way you're describing that, how important that is. Wow. Something about the outdoors.
Yeah, it pours back into that inspirational well. It awakens that childlike awe and wonder that we need to stay creative.
So good. Yeah, Doctor, as you, over the years, as God began to give you this message about rest and you ultimately wrote the book, what was that transition like for you? You're practicing, and then now you're talking about wellness and rest. Was there anybody that kind of wrinkled their eyebrow like, what Dr. Dalton-Smith is doing? What? No.
I wrinkled my eyebrow because that wasn't what I wanted to do. Since the age of 5, the only thing I've ever wanted to be was a physician. That was the only thing I could think of that I ever wanted to do. And so becoming a doctor was like my dream. It's everything I ever wanted. I started at some point during my medical practice. God started infiltrating it. It's the best way I can put it. And so I started inviting him more into the conversation with people. I put these little, they're called daily breads. There's these little books that I would get in the mail and I put out for my patients. And if I happened to see so they were in the patient rooms when I walk in. And, it takes doctors a while to get to the room, right? So if I happened to see them flipping through the book, that to me was my sign that they were at least open to a spiritual conversation. I had some like little handouts and things that I made that just had like some of the things I'm sharing with you. There's some things God had spoken to my heart about regarding health and wellness and different ways of looking at things. And so I was handing these things out to patients, not really thinking too much about it. And then it got to a point where my nurse was like, you're going to have to do something. You're spending way too much time in these rooms. We're getting way too behind. It was like, you need to write a book. So, I wrote my very first book, and that led to a couple of other books. And, the most recent one, the one that you're mentioning, Sacred Rest, that book kind of took a life of its own. I say it's the one God breathed upon. I love all the books that I've written, but that one, there was something there that was not there for the other books. And he opened up to some amazing doors in secular places. TEDx reached out to me and asked me if I would be the opening speaker for their event in Atlanta, which I did. At the time, I didn't even know that was a thing. I thought you had to apply and do all this stuff for TEDx, and they were just like, hey, can you come talk? Kind of thing. I never heard of that before. And so in that talk, kind of got picked up by a lot of different places, CNN Health and Fast Company and all these other places. And from there, people started calling and asking if I could come and share this with their CEOs, and a business was born out of that after all of those things.
Wow. It's amazing what God does. I love the way you described that, Doctor, as God infiltrated the business. I love that. I'm going to have to use that one and say, hey, I remember this one time Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith told me God infiltrated. And I think that brings up a great point, Doctor. That was certainly one of them for you, but what was a major faith turning point in your life that was very vivid? What was a major one for you?
Well, related to business, I would probably say taking the step from full-time clinical practice into starting my own company. So Restorasis, the work-life-integration company that I'm managing at this point, that wasn't something I'd ever thought about, and I knew I wasn't, and I started doing it kind of like almost like a hobby is how it started off. It's like, oh, I'll just do this on the side, until it was not possible to do it on the side. It was getting bigger than I could do in my part-time. And so having to step away from full-time clinical practice, and a full-time 6-figure salary, to be able to do what I feel like God was calling me to do felt strange. It felt dangerous. It felt risky. But he honored that step of obedience. And I think that's something that we have to sometimes come to grips with. I call it, I posted about this recently, I call it a holy dependence. There's a level of holy dependence that's required to be able to step out into the unknown with God. And as long as we're holding on to our levels of comfort and security and all those things that we're like, but it's so good, you never get to that holy dependence. And that holy dependence is uncomfortable because it's unfamiliar for us to be in that level of kind of continuous risk, but is also exhilarating. I think I have so much more joy in the work because I get to see God show up at times when I don't expect. I get to be surprised. The day-to-day, mundane, same in, same out every day is completely gone because every day is a like, oh, what's God going to do now? Kind of day.
Wow, the anticipation of just what he's going to do. Wow, that is huge. Doctor, as we get ready to go, you obviously having the practice and then starting a company, what's one major business principle that you've learned on your journey that you would just share with those kingdom entrepreneurs or kingdom corporate? What's maybe one big business principle that you've learned over the years?
Invest in mentors that are further along than you. I think that was something that I attached to very early on, and have found it to be extremely beneficial because, I'm running a medical practice with a group. It's a group practice. We have multiple leaders, different roles. But I never run an entire company then have to hire people, without a team of people working with me to hire them. And so I think it was really important for me early on to get some sound counsel underway. And as the business has grown, because it's every year we see kind of growth in different directions and expansion, to call in new people that I need for the new level of advancement that God's moving us to. And so I think it's important to recognize you don't arrive. If you're thinking from glory to glory, you're going to need to be able to have people in your life that are further along than you so that you're always being encouraged to grow and to learn and to expand.
So good. The power of mentorship, those who have walked the path where we have not been. Very, very insightful. Well, Doctor, we thank you so much for hanging out with us here on the Fortified Life. You have given us immense gold and gems. I know I've certainly got my copy of Sacred Rest, but where can all the listeners get a copy of your book and follow all the great work that you're doing?
Yeah, I would. The book's available wherever books are sold. It's Sacred Rest, Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, Restore Your Sanity. It's on Amazon as an audiobook as well. If you prefer to listen, as I do, then sit down with a book sometimes. And I recommend for anybody who's listening to this is like, oh, which of the 7 do I need, or do I need all of them? I have a free assessment at restquiz.com. It's very simple, restquiz.com. You get one email with your results at the end, and then you get an option to sign up to follow me after that. So you don't automatically add it to my email list because I am anti-email for the most part, unless it's something you really want. So you get an opportunity to find out your personal rest deficit without being automatically added to anything. So I welcome anybody who's curious about which of the 7 you need to consider visiting restquiz.com.
Love it. And folks, don't you worry. In this information age, this episode will be available on demand, so you can go back and re-listen to all the wonderful things Dr. Dalton-Smith has shared. And we'll have links in the show notes to her book as well as the quiz. Well, Doctor, I know I've had a wonderful time in this conversation. Thank you so much for stopping by on this podcast episode.
Thank you.
All right. Well, folks, you know how we leave things. Don't compartmentalize your faith in the marketplace. And from the boardroom to the bathroom, God is with you. We'll see you next time on the Fortified Life podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fortified Life podcast. You can catch us live on Wednesdays at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time and on demand. Check out fortifiedlifepodcast.com for more details. To learn how to live out your faith in the marketplace, grab a copy of Jason Davis's book, Fortified, Being Rooted in God's Plan for Work and Business, available on Amazon.
You're listening to Dr's Life Worldwide Podcast.